If you observe the national debt clock in Times Square or review the official figures released by the U.S. Treasury, you will encounter a staggering number that truly defies human comprehension. It is currently rapidly surging past $35 trillion and accelerating towards an almost unimaginable $38 trillion. To properly contextualize this immense sum, consider that if you were to stack 38 trillion single-dollar bills one on top of the other, the resulting pile would not merely reach the moon, but extend far beyond it into space. For many decades, politicians and economists alike have largely brushed aside this formidable figure. They assured us that budget deficits held little consequence because, after all, we supposedly owed the money to ourselves, or they maintained that the debt remained perfectly manageable as long as the economy continued to grow. Essentially, they treated the national debt as if it were a high score in a video game, a seemingly alarming number, yet one with no tangible repercussions in the real world. However, as we find ourselves in 2024, the fundamental calculus has undeniably shifted. We have now entered a new and inescapable era of fiscal reality where this debt is no longer a mere abstract figure. Instead, it has transformed into a relentless predator, systematically beginning to devour the very budget of the United States government. For the very first time in the nation's history, the U.S. government is allocating more funds to cover the interest payments on its immense debt than it is spending on the vital mission of national defense. Pause for a moment and truly consider the gravity of this situation. We are effectively spending more resources to compensate the bondholders of the past than we are to adequately equip the military forces designed to protect us in the present. This allocation even surpasses the entire budget dedicated to the comprehensive Medicaid program. The interest bill alone is now rapidly approaching an astounding $1 trillion each year. This creates a truly terrifying phenomenon that economists refer to as the debt spiral. In a typical household faced with excessive debt, one would instinctively cut back on spending, perhaps foregoing dining out or canceling a streaming service subscription. But a government, unlike a household, operates under vastly different constraints. A substantial portion of U.S. government spending is legally mandated, particularly for programs like Social Security and Medicare. These represent solemn promises made to an ever-growing aging population, promises that are politically unfeasible to break. Consequently, the government finds itself unable to significantly cut spending. Instead, to simply service the interest payments on its existing debt, the government is compelled to issue new debt. It is akin to borrowing from a brand new credit card just to make the minimum monthly payment on an old one. This continuous cycle inevitably inflates the total debt, which in turn escalates future interest payments, thereby necessitating even more borrowing. It is a self-perpetuating mathematical feedback loop, destined to lead to exponential growth. The truly chilling reality is that there is no conventional, straightforward escape from this predicament. Historically, only 3 traditional avenues exist for a sovereign nation to alleviate a debt burden of such colossal magnitude. And in the United States of today, 2 of these options are rendered politically impossible. The first option is austerity. This path entails implementing massive tax increases coupled with draconian spending cuts. To truly balance the budget and begin making meaningful inroads into reducing the debt, the government would be forced to either double income taxes for its citizens or completely dismantle the U.S. military. Neither of these extreme measures is remotely likely to occur. Any politician who dared to propose slashing Social Security checks by a drastic 30% would be committing undeniable political suicide. Similarly, any president advocating for a 70% income tax rate would be voted out of office in an overwhelming landslide. The American economy has developed a profound addiction to government spending. To abruptly pull the plug on this would instantly trigger an economic catastrophe akin to a Great Depression. Thus, austerity is unequivocally off the table. The second option is outright default. The government could simply step to a podium and declare, "We are not paying our debts." This is a course of action that nations like Argentina or Russia have resorted to in the past. However, for the United States, as the issuer of the world's primary global reserve currency, this represents the absolute nuclear option. The entire global financial system, every bank, every pension fund, every international trade contract, is fundamentally constructed on the bedrock assumption that U.S. Treasury bonds are the safest, most risk-free asset in existence. Should the U.S. default, the intricate global banking system would collapse overnight. International trade would grind to a halt, and even credit cards would cease to function. It would unleash an unprecedented financial apocalypse. Therefore, an explicit default is also definitively off the table. That leaves only a single viable option. It is the third choice, the path that virtually every empire throughout history, from ancient Rome to Weimar Germany to post-war Britain, has ultimately embraced. It is the route of least resistance, known as the soft default. With this approach, you do not outright refuse to repay the debt. You meticulously pay back every single cent of it, but crucially, You repay it in a currency that is worth significantly less than when it was originally borrowed. Essentially, you print the difference. This is not some speculative conspiracy theory. It is, in fact, the official, albeit unspoken, policy currently being pursued by the United States government. It is a calculated process of financial repression, specifically engineered to covertly transfer wealth from diligent savers to the state. The primary objective is to deliberately maintain the interest rate on the national debt at a level consistently below the true rate of inflation. Let us briefly consider the arithmetic of this strategy. If the government currently owes $30 trillion and the annual inflation rate is maintained at 5%, the real purchasing power value of that debt effectively shrinks by 5% each year. In terms of actual buying power, the government would have just erased $1. 5 trillion of debt in a single year, all without having to raise a single tax or cut a single government program. The bondholders technically receive their money back, but that money now purchases fewer groceries, fewer homes, and fewer goods. Its diminished value often conveniently attributed to supply chain issues or dismissed as merely transitory inflation. We are presently witnessing a historic and profound shift in monetary policy, a phenomenon termed fiscal dominance. For the past 4 decades, the Federal Reserve largely acted as the independent master of monetary policy. Its paramount duty was to combat inflation by raising interest rates, even if doing so caused some pain to the broader economy. Today, however, the Treasury has effectively become the master. The national debt has ballooned to such gargantuan proportions that the Fed simply cannot raise interest rates high enough to genuinely stifle inflation, because doing so would inevitably bankrupt the U.S. government itself. If interest rates were to surge to 10%, as they did during the 1980s, the annual interest payments on a $38 trillion debt would skyrocket to $8 trillion, a sum exceeding the nation's total tax revenue. Such a scenario would lead to the immediate collapse of the government. Consequently, the Fed is being compelled to tolerate higher levels of inflation. It is forced to maintain interest rates at levels far lower than economic fundamentals would dictate. It is, in essence, being forced to become an enabler of the Treasury's insatiable spending habits. The storied independence of the central bank is slowly but surely dying. We are rapidly transitioning into an era where the money printer is permanently fused to the government budget. This, then, is the hidden crisis. It is not a sudden, cataclysmic crash, but rather a slow, insidious boil. The $38 trillion national debt figure will relentlessly continue its ascent. It will soon hit $40 trillion, then $50 trillion, and beyond. Simultaneously, the purchasing power of the dollar will persistently erode. The government is banking on its ability to inflate away the debt faster than the markets can descend into panic. It is a profoundly dangerous high-wire act. If they print money too slowly, the crushing weight of the debt will overwhelm them. If they print too rapidly, they risk triggering devastating hyperinflation. Their strategy involves trying to thread an incredibly fine needle, attempting to maintain inflation at a seemingly manageable 4% or 5% for an entire decade. While this might sound innocuous, the compound effect over time is utterly devastating. At a consistent 5% inflation rate, the real value of your hard-earned savings is effectively cut in half within just 14 years. This, precisely, is the implicit plan to wipe out half the real value of the national debt, and concurrently half the value of your personal savings by the mid-2030s. In the subsequent discussion, we will meticulously dissect the specific mechanisms and tools the government employs to achieve this. We will delve into an explanation of yield curve control, the subtle manipulation of the Consumer Price Index, CPI, and how the banking system is effectively compelled to purchase government debt that few others genuinely desire. We will then examine the intricate mechanics of this vast wealth transfer from Main Street to Washington. To truly grasp how the government intends to make $38 trillion seemingly vanish, you don't require a crystal ball. All you really need is a history book. We are not traversing uncharted territory here. Instead, we are observing a deliberate rerun of the exact economic playbook that the United States successfully deployed following World War II. In 1945, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio soared to an alarming 119%. The government did not manage to pay off this debt through massive tax increases. Nor did it resort to an explicit default. Rather, it effectively liquidated the debt through a sustained period of negative real interest rates. For an entire decade, the Federal Reserve deliberately capped interest rates at a mere 2.5%, while inflation consistently averaged over 6%. This meant that every year, bondholders passively lost 3.5% of their purchasing power. This was an intentional and highly effective transfer of wealth from private savers to the state. Today, this very same strategy has been resurrected, but it has been significantly upgraded with 3 modern tools, each meticulously designed to ensure that you do not fully perceive the ongoing theft until it is far too late to react. Tool number 1 is the captive buyer. In a truly free market, if a government finds itself $38 trillion in debt and spending with reckless abandon, rational investors would naturally demand a much higher interest rate to lend it money. They would justifiably say, "You are a highly risky borrower. Compensate me with 10% interest." However, the US government simply cannot afford such rates. Therefore, it systematically rigs the market by creating a captive audience for its debt through a complex labyrinth of banking regulations, such as Basel III and Dodd-Frank. The government effectively forces banks, insurance companies, and pension funds to hold substantial quantities of US Treasury bonds. Regulators officially designate US Treasuries as high-quality liquid assets, HQLA. Banks are legally mandated to hold these assets to satisfy their liquidity coverage ratios. It becomes irrelevant whether these bonds pay a meager 0.1% return or if they are actively losing value in real terms. Banks are legally compelled to acquire them simply to remain in business. This regulatory requirement generates artificial demand, coercing the entire financial system to lend money to the government at artificially suppressed rates, regardless of the inherent risk involved. Your pension fund is not buying government debt because it is a sound investment. It is buying it because it is legally prohibited not to. Tool number 2 is the broken compass, specifically referencing the Consumer Price Index, CPI. If your goal is to reduce payments to people, but you have promised to compensate them based on inflation, the simplest solution is to redefine what inflation actually means. Social Security payments, certain wages, and Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, are all directly linked to the official Consumer Price Index. If the reported CPI is 10%, the government is legally obligated to pay out 10% more. Consequently, the government possesses a multi-billion-dollar incentive to keep the official CPI number artificially low. Since the 1980s, the methodology for calculating CPI has been subtly and quietly rewritten to systematically suppress the official reported figure. They introduced substitution bias. The underlying logic here is that if the price of a steak rises, you presumably won't buy steak. You'll opt for a cheaper hamburger instead. Therefore, your cost of living hasn't really increased as much as the price of steak alone would suggest. The CPI tracks the hamburger, effectively ignoring the inconvenient fact that your standard of living has demonstrably dropped. They also introduced hedonic adjustments. For instance, if a new car costs $5,000 more than the previous model but comes equipped with better safety features or advanced technology, the government argues that the actual price didn't truly go up. The price increase is statistically adjusted downward because the quality is deemed higher. These statistical sleights of hand have cumulatively saved the government billions of dollars. If we were to apply the 1980 CPI methodology today, official inflation figures would consistently be double the currently reported number. The government is essentially gaslighting you about the actual cost of your own survival to protect its precarious budget. Tool number 3 is fiscal dominance. Finally, we arrive at what is often referred to as the central bank put. Historically, the Federal Reserve maintained a strong degree of independence, with its core mission being to safeguard the value of the dollar. However, under the regime of fiscal dominance, the Fed gradually loses its independence. This primary objective now shifts to keeping the Treasury solvent at all costs. When foreign nations such as China or Japan begin to significantly reduce their purchases of US debt, a trend that has already begun, the Fed steps in as the buyer of last resort. It simply prints new money to acquire the bonds that nobody else wants. This process is known as quantitative easing, QE. By buying up this debt, the Fed artificially suppresses the yield, thereby keeping the government's interest bill deceptively affordable. However, this action simultaneously floods the economy with a massive influx of new dollars. The predictable result is that the stock market soars, real estate prices escalate dramatically, and the price of various assets becomes increasingly disconnected from underlying economic reality. This is the everything bubble. It creates a pervasive illusion of wealth. Your 401k balance appears higher, and your home's valuation seems to climb. But this is merely a monetary mirage. You possess more dollars, yes, but those dollars collectively buy significantly less than they did 10 years ago. The government is effectively paying off its colossal debt by systematically diluting your individual share of the economic pie. The verdict is clear. The US government is not going to explicitly default on its debt. Instead, it is going to inflate its way out. It is going to intentionally keep interest rates below the real rate of inflation for the foreseeable future, likely for the next decade. This is the silent eraser. If you maintain your money in a savings account earning a modest 4% while the true rate of inflation is closer to 8%, then you are, in essence, the one paying off the national debt. You are part of the donor class. The only effective way to opt out of this rigged system is to own scarce assets that the government cannot simply print into existence. Serious, direct-to-camera, We've extensively discussed how the government employs inflation and intricate regulations to silently appropriate your wealth. Yet, history has repeatedly shown that there are times when this subtle approach isn't rapid enough. When a government truly reaches a point of desperation, it ceases to be nuanced. Stops asking. It simply takes. In 1933, the United States government, paradoxically known as the land of the free, did precisely that. They criminalized the private ownership of the single most important asset that allowed citizens to effectively protect themselves from unchecked inflation. Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, which mandated the seizure of gold from every American citizen, under the draconian threat of 10 years in prison for noncompliance. In our next video, we are going to unveil the full, unvarnished story of this monumental gold seizure. We will expose the secret prosecutions, illuminate the legal loopholes the wealthy skillfully exploited to escape, and meticulously examine the terrifying legal precedent that allows a president, during a declared national emergency, to potentially seize your Bitcoin, your gold, and even your 401k retirement savings today. It is imperative that you understand if your financial safe is, in fact, truly safe. Please smash that like button to help keep this vital signal alive and subscribe so you don't miss the compelling history of the gold ban. I'll see you in the vault. We have now firmly established that the government is systematically erasing its debt by simultaneously eroding the value of your money. However, this process is far from impacting everyone equally. In fact, it serves as the primary engine driving the escalating inequality that is progressively tearing the fabric of the United States apart. To comprehend the underlying reasons for this, we must revisit the observations of an 18th-century French economist named Richard Cantillon. He meticulously observed a phenomenon that is now widely recognized as the Cantillon effect. He astutely realized that the specific point at which new money enters the economy is of profound importance. When the Federal Reserve decides to print $1 trillion, they don't distribute it by dropping it from helicopters over Iowa farmland. They certainly don't mail a check to every single citizen. Instead, they inject this newly created money directly into the financial sector. They purchase bonds from powerful institutions like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and BlackRock. These privileged institutions are the first recipients of this fresh money. They acquire it at essentially zero interest. They then leverage this free cash to acquire various assets, stocks, real estate, and technology companies. By the time this new money slowly trickles down to the average worker in the form of wages, prices for goods and services have already significantly risen. Consequently, the rich gain access to the new money before inflation fully impacts its value, while the poor and middle class receive the money only after inflation has already eroded its purchasing power. This fundamental dynamic explains why, ever since 2008, we have witnessed the emergence of a starkly K-shaped economy. The asset-owning class, roughly the top 10% of the population, has experienced an explosion in their wealth because the Fed's policies are directly inflating the value of their stocks and homes. Conversely, the wage-earning class, encompassing the bottom 90%, has seen their purchasing power steadily collapse, as their stagnant wages simply cannot keep pace with the relentlessly rising prices of rent and everyday groceries. In essence, the national debt is being effectively paid off by the gradual liquidation of the American middle class. The era of risk-free saving has ended. This overarching dynamic is compelling a fundamental and unavoidable transformation in how we must now approach the concept of saving and wealth preservation. For the past 40 years, the prevailing conventional wisdom advised working diligently, saving 10% of one's income, depositing it into a bank account, and investing in government bonds. This formed the bedrock of the classic 60-40 portfolio. It was a strategy perfectly suited for a world where money reliably held its value over time. However, in a world dominated by fiscal imperatives, such advice amounts to financial suicide. If you choose to save in pure cash, you are virtually guaranteed to lose significant purchasing power. If you invest in government bonds, you are similarly guaranteed to experience an erosion of your wealth in real terms. We are unequivocally entering an era of forced speculation. To simply preserve your existing wealth, you are now compelled to assume greater risks. You are effectively forced to buy stocks, real estate, or even cryptocurrencies merely to outrun the relentless devaluation of the currency. The government has, by design, transformed the entire economy into a vast casino where one must gamble just to survive, precisely because the traditionally safe option, simply saving, is being systematically and deliberately destroyed. The endgame, however, lies with central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. This ultimate tool in the government's formidable arsenal has not yet been fully deployed. It is currently under intensive development in the secretive basement laboratories of the Federal Reserve. It is the central bank digital currency, CBDC. At present, the government's capacity to directly manipulate the economy is somewhat limited by the continued existence of physical cash. For example, if the Fed were to implement extremely high interest rates to accelerate the debt's erasure, You could simply withdraw your physical cash from the bank and conceal it under your mattress to circumvent any punitive measures. Physical cash represents the ultimate check on government power. It allows you a crucial exit ramp from the controlled banking system. A CBDC, by its very nature, eliminates that vital exit. If the dollar were to become purely digital, the Federal Reserve would gain unprecedented total control over every aspect of your financial life. They could instantaneously implement negative interest rates, deducting, for example, 1% from your balance every single month to compel you to spend. They could even impose expiry dates on money, dictating that your stimulus check, for instance, must be spent within 30 days or it simply vanishes. This is not science fiction or theoretical speculation. Such functionalities are already being actively tested in China with its digital yuan. The digital dollar is poised to become the ultimate solution to the looming debt crisis. It would bestow upon the state the unprecedented power to micromanage the velocity of money and to confiscate wealth with just a few lines of computer code. The transition to a cashless society is not primarily about convenience. It is, fundamentally, about absolute control. It is about ensuring that no escape valve remains open when the great wealth transfer inevitably accelerates. The verdict stands firm. The United States is currently in the process of defaulting. It is a slow, polite, and deeply bureaucratic default, but it is a default nonetheless. The $38 trillion debt will never be truly repaid in real purchasing power terms. The clear winners in this unfolding drama will be those who possess scarce, tangible assets. Real estate, physical gold, Bitcoin, and profitable businesses. Essentially, anything that cannot be simply printed into existence. The unfortunate losers will be those who place their unwavering trust in the fiat currency and the established financial institutions. The cherished American dream of diligently saving your way to prosperity is effectively dead. We are now inescapably engaged in a high-stakes game of asset survival. Serious, direct-to-camera, we've just discussed how the government utilizes inflation and increasingly digital controls to slowly appropriate your wealth. Yet, history unequivocally demonstrates that when a government becomes truly desperate, it abandons all pretense of subtlety. It stops asking politely. It simply takes what it wants. In 1933, the United States government, a nation founded on principles of freedom, did precisely that. It unilaterally criminalized the private ownership of the one asset that offered citizens genuine protection against rampant inflation. Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, which ordered the seizure of gold from every American citizen, under the chilling threat of 10 years in federal prison for noncompliance. In our next compelling video, we will unveil the full, unexpurgated story of this monumental gold seizure. We will bring to light the secret prosecutions, reveal the cunning legal loopholes that the wealthy skillfully exploited to evade compliance, and meticulously dissect the terrifying legal precedent that now permits the president, during a declared national emergency today, to potentially seize your Bitcoin, your gold, and even your 401k retirement savings. It is absolutely crucial for you to know whether your personal financial safe is, in fact, truly safe. Please smash that like button to help ensure this critical information reaches a wider audience, and subscribe so you absolutely do not miss the intricate history of the gold ban. I'll see you in the vault.